For me, I've been utterly convinced after 3 weeks with this thing as my primary home monitor. For me, the best monitor right now is a TV. It's this one. It's the LG C1 48-inch. I don't want a smaller one. I don't want a bigger one. This is the one. This is it. I'm keeping it. I love it. If that's what you wanted to know, that's it. However, you should stick around because I don't think this is going to be perfect for everybody. Got a lot of thoughts, but why are people even buying these TVs to use as monitors? So let's quickly jump into a little bit of that. Well, first of all, it's the specs. This is 4K, it's 120 hertz, it has variable refresh rate support, so FreeSync and G-Sync. It has, did I say glorious HDR? It does, and it is OLED, meaning that you get these blacks where the pixels are actually off when that's black. It's hard to tell this stuff on camera, but on a normal screen, the black is really gray. And on a lot of IPS screens, you're gonna get some glow around the edges. This doesn't have any of those issues. Not only that, but due to this being OLED, you get better pixel response time than pretty much any other technology right now, meaning absolutely no motion blur ghosting. I've actually returned a really expensive ultra-wide monitor a couple of years ago because the gray-to-gray response times smeared across the screen in certain scenes, and I was like, nope, I am returning that. This does not have those issues. It doesn't have input latency issues. It's incredibly responsive in terms of input latency as well as pixel response time. All of that stuff is absolute top-notch on this thing. So that's why people are interested in them. But it's like, well, why don't you just buy a monitor that does all of that? Well, for one thing, because most monitors don't offer OLED, and the ones that do are usually more geared around professional stats for color accuracy and all of that, not geared for gaming with the 120 hertz variable refresh rate. But you might be like, didn't Gigabyte just launch a 48-inch OLED? That's true, Gigabyte did. It launched really around the time I was buying this, so I considered buying that, at least right now, and at the time I was buying this, that cost more, and there weren't as many professional reviews available for it, but the ones I did see seem to bring up some issues where it might not actually be quite as good at this. But just really quickly on that note, the main reasons you'd want to look into that Gigabyte OLED's 48-inch monitor, which is using, as far as I know, this same LG OLED panel, but then they're building a monitor around it, is it does have a DisplayPort input, whereas this one you're going to have to live with HDMI 2.1. HDMI 2.1 is only available on RTX 3000 and AMD 6000 series cards, and you can still use HDMI 2.0 from an older card, but it won't support all of the full stats. Real quick note on that, if you're on an HDMI 2.0 connection, you can get 4K HDR 60 Hz with variable refresh rate, only at 8-bit color, not 10-bit, but you'll hardly notice the difference, I promise. And you could bump up to the 120 Hz support with the variable refresh rate at 4K, but with 420 chroma subsampling. What does that mean? It means you really probably won't notice it, but there are certain situations where like colored text on a colored screen kind of fringes a little bit. It's not that big of a deal, but that mode, 120 Hz, loses HDR support on an HDMI 2.0 cable. There's some workarounds for that with either a DisplayPort to HDMI 2.1 adapter or a USB Type-C if your GPU has that kind of output adapter, which can get you the full stats in terms of the picture quality, but those adapters lose variable refresh rate support. That's your FreeSync G-Sync. So there are some compromises here if you don't have that 2.1 output, whereas on the OLED monitor from Gigabyte, you do have the DisplayPorts, which are widely supported on older monitors, older GPUs, there we go. But keep in mind, if you like me and you bought this thing when you had an RTX 2070, for example, I ended up upgrading my GPU because this thing is 4K, and 4K is hard to run on an older card, so if you're buying a 4K display, you might be buying the latest GPUs anyway. But just something to think about. Now, I think you could be perfectly happy on this thing, if you have like a 2080 Ti that doesn't have HDMI 2.1, you could be perfectly happy on that for a little while until you can afford a newer GPU using one of those other modes that I mentioned. A few downsides to this not actually being a monitor. The last one I can think of, other than the DisplayPort, is just that it doesn't have like a built-in USB hub, which some monitors do, like my old one, meaning if I got rid of my old monitor, I have to buy an actual USB hub. I don't think that's the end of the world, but yeah, something to think about that some monitors actually offer. Other than that, I really don't notice the fact that this is supposedly a TV and not a monitor once I adjusted a couple of settings. Out of the box, when I turned this on, when it initially turns on, it would have the streaming apps pop up for a second, which is really annoying because I wasn't using this for those streaming apps. It's cool that this has those streaming apps. Another actual, in my opinion, good feature this has over a monitor is the built-in streaming apps, but I didn't want them popping up on the screen. Now it's buried in the menus, but you actually can turn that off, okay? So if you have one of these, by the way, and you didn't know that, you can turn that off. It doesn't need to pop up the streaming apps at the beginning. So other than that, once that was turned off, I really don't notice the fact that this is supposedly a monitor instead of a TV. I mean, it has a remote. I don't really use it. It has a little nub down here at the bottom of the screen, very similar to the one on my LG ultra-wide monitor over there. I can turn it off and on with that, and that's all I really need. So once you got everything set up, that's great. Except I'd like to say that's all I really need, but I'm gonna get into what I found to be the most annoying little thing, which can hopefully be solved soon in a software update. When this thing detects a variable refresh rate input source, it switches on this like game optimized audio thing. I'll show it to you here. I don't think my camera's actually focused on the screen and I don't have a camera guy, so deal with it. But so I'm going to the settings here. I'm opening up the game optimizer. And when this thing power cycles, it always turns this on whenever you're on a variable refresh rate input. Right over here, it says AI game sound, and right now it's turned on because I just turned on the TV. I can turn that off. And the reason why I think that's a big deal is just that, in my opinion, maybe this would be a good time to talk about the speakers. In my opinion, the AI game optimizer sounds terrible. It makes everything sound really harsh and processed to me. I'm used to using either really high-end headphones or high-end computer, like studio monitors that you'd mix music on. And that sounded really harsh, and I didn't like it. But then, I was actually worried, because let's talk about why I was worried about this. I don't have room to put a speaker over here due to the size of this. Now, you might not be in that same situation, or if you wall mount it, you could maybe get a sound bar under it or something like that. But in my actual setup here, this basement wall down here doesn't really have studs in it, apparently. I checked. I could not find anything that I'd trust hanging this thing on. So I couldn't get it up on the wall, and I couldn't get speakers in on the side, so I was like, well, I mean, I usually just use the headphones, but when I'm not, I hope the TV has decent sound. I would never use monitor speakers. Like the monitors in this ultra-wide, those don't get used, never. I wouldn't even think about using them. They sound like tinny little just nonsense, just no thank you. But this was a TV, so I was like, and it's big, so I was like, hey, maybe this thing will actually have decent sound. When I initially tried it, thought, terrible. When I found out that game optimizer could be turned off, I turned it off, and I was like, wow, this is actually pretty usable. Now, don't get me wrong, it's not going to compare to a good sound bar or good, like my studio monitor speakers over here. Absolutely not. But could I actually just use that sound to watch a video or play a game and not really worry about it? It sounds fine. Absolutely, which is great, except like I said, for the fact that every time this power cycles, either the computer or the TV power cycles, at least on the current software installed on it, it detects a new variable refresh rate input, and it must just think, gaming mode. It turns on the AI game optimizer, which to me sounds bad, although when I tested it, I will say it might slightly improve like the spatial positioning, like if I need to know where the footsteps are coming from, but if I was playing that kind of game, I'd be on the headphones anyway. Those are the minor annoyances, and the one reason why I can't just like put away the remote and just never have it nearby. So if LG, if you watch this video, or if anybody do you know anybody at LG? LG, please fix, just save the user setting there. If I turned off AI game sound, leave it saved as off until I turn it back on, not just when it power cycles the input source, please. Anyway, so those are the few little minor annoyances I've had with this thing. Other than that, it could just be a monitor, and it's a fantastic one, amazing. Now, Other slight little annoyances before I start breaking into who should buy this thing for various use cases and who should steer clear. So the one real downside to OLED is the pixel burn-in potential. I haven't had any issues with that, but I would highly recommend going over to Ratings, RTINGS, right? Ratings, they've done some extended OLED pixel burn-in tests. And if you're interested in that topic, I'd recommend watching their videos on it. They've done a couple of them now where they're running a bunch of different TVs and different setups and different use cases and content types and seeing what kind of burn-in they get in. All that really means is that if you have the same image in the same spot for a really long time, especially if it's bright with saturated colors, that can actually kind of damage those pixels on the screen to where it kind of saves a little ghosted image retention of that if that's there for a really long period of time. Like I said, I haven't had any issues with it, but like I'm using a screensaver right now. I haven't used a screensaver in years. I have it turned on, which I think looks really cool. This is just one of the built-in ones, the windows. I think it looks really cool with the black here and the colors popping by and all that. So that's one of the things that I'm doing. So I have that set to pop on if I'm not using it for a minute, because if you have static desktop icons or things like that, they could cause some potential burn-in. Now, things I've done to alleviate that without going overboard, so if I leave my screensaver here, I don't know if I'll keep this, but one thing I've tried out on somebody's suggestion is I've actually set my desktop wallpaper using Wallpaper Engine, which is something you can buy on Steam, where you can set moving videos as your wallpaper. Now, my only real issue with that is it could maybe be a little bit distracting, or it could also maybe be using a little bit of system resources in the background. So I don't know if I'll keep it, but it's something interesting. And right now I've got it set to one of the like LG OLED demos, so it kind of looks cool and all that. Anyway, also my desktop icons, I will occasionally just kind of drag to the other part of the screen so they're not always every single day in the same spot. Also, my taskbar. There's an easy setting in Windows to make it so the taskbar only shows up when you mouse over it. It's not there all the time. So these are all things that I think are pretty reasonable and easy to do to avoid pixel burn-in. But just the fact that you have to think about that is a little bit annoying. Also, the TV itself has some pixel burn-in protection features which could be slightly annoying. One of them is this pixel shift thing, which honestly in the few weeks I've been using this, I've only noticed happen a couple of times, but it actually, well, shifts the pixels. So things that like would be on the very edge of the screen might get actually moved slightly off screen. And that's not going to be that big of a deal, but it can be noticeable. It doesn't really bother me personally, but it's something to think about, and maybe you could research more to see if that's going to be just a deal breaker for you. But I will note that as far as I know, the other OLED like monitor from Gigabyte also has to have these protection features, including the one I'm about to mention, which is if you open up a big white window. So for example, my display settings, if it's small, it can be brighter than when it's big. I don't know how well this is catching up on camera because it's going to be doing some auto adjustments to the lighting. But on a big screen like this is dimmer than this, and that brightens up. And that can be a little bit obnoxious, a little bit annoying, although I will say that only happens when Windows is set to HDR mode. And so one very reasonable thing you might want to do is just have Windows not in HDR mode when you're not using HDR. And then it doesn't happen, okay? But I did want to mention that that's a thing. Now, yeah, for me personally, I actually usually leave HDR off unless I'm viewing HDR content. Many games can still enable HDR without HDR being turned on in the display settings. You can just do it in the game itself, although some games won't accurately detect HDR support unless it's turned on in the Windows settings. And I will just as a little side note mention that I wish that Windows and HDR worked together a little nicer than they do. I'm hopeful that Windows 11 will be a little better about that. I didn't really buy this for the HDR. I bought it for like the black levels and stuff. However, I've been pleasantly surprised by it. In some games, I don't really care. I don't think it's that great. But in other games, I was really impressed by it. Been like Ori and the Will-o'-the-Wisps. I thought the HDR in that was really impressive. I liked it in Doom Eternal. There's been a few others. In some other games, it was like, meh, take it or leave it. So HDR is cool. I wish the Windows support was slightly better, and I'm hopeful that in Windows 11 it will be. But in games that do it well, it is really nice. So the last few things that I've seen people mention can kind of annoy them about this TV, or why it might not be a good fit for you. For one, is that the screen is reflective more so than a normal monitor. This is like, you can see there's a really bright light right here from me filming my video, and you can see that reflecting in the screen here, but you can see that it's kind of muted and washed out. You don't see a direct like mirror reflection there. In a screen like this, it's going to be more of an actual mirrored reflection where you could, you know, make out the details, although we're not lighting at an angle here where you can really see that on the screen. I'll just say that if you have bright lights or windows right behind you, so it's reflecting directly on the screen, you will see more of those reflections. And speaking of brightness, some people have said that these aren't great for a really bright room. I don't have it in a really bright room, so I can't actually test that. I'm down actually in a basement media movie watching gaming room. But there are a lot of lights on right now for me filming this video for the lighting, and using the screen is really pretty much fine. So I would say I think that the worries about this not being bright enough for a bright room are a little overblown. The last thing I've seen people complain about online is color banding in games, where like you see, you know, in a sunset or something, like you can see distinct lines between the colors instead of them like blending smoothly. And I've got to say that in my actual gaming on this thing, I haven't noticed that, or at least if it was there, it didn't pop out as something I noticed. I'm not saying it wasn't there at all. I don't know what's going on with that. All I can say is that in my personal use, which has been testing out a lot of games briefly, although I've really been spending most of my time on Red Dead Redemption 2, because in glorious 4K on this big giant immersive screen, it's kind of renewed my interest in that game. I haven't noticed that for myself. I don't know, if it starts becoming an issue, like I said, maybe I'll do some update video, but it hasn't really bothered me. And I'll kind of swing into this right now, which is, okay, so if I'm really gonna sell you on this, or decide, is it worth it, has this increased my enjoyment of gaming? And the answer is yes, it actually has, and how can I measure that? Well, I mentioned Red Dead Redemption 2 for a second. I had kind of got bored of that game after 20 hours or so, and I hadn't anywhere come near to finishing it when I was playing on my ultrawide monitor. However, when I was just testing it out on this monitor, I got sucked in, and other than when I'm forcing myself to test other games for the sake of the review, I really just wanted to play Red Dead Redemption 2, because what even on my 34-inch ultrawide kind of got annoying, which was just riding around through the scenery. There's a lot of just riding your horse in Red Dead Redemption 2. Whatever you think of the game, you gotta admit, there's a lot of just riding your horse. So how much you enjoy the game might depend on how much you enjoy just riding your horse through the scenery. Got a little bored of it even on my really nice ultrawide. Still, after a few weeks and many, many hours in the game, on this screen, just that experience of just being immersed in that scenery is glorious, and I haven't got tired of it, and it has actually definitely measurably increased my enjoyment of the game. So I think that's the biggest plus I could give to a monitor. It actually has improved my gaming experience noticeably and measurably. And what's really surprising to me about that is one of the things that I didn't actually want when I bought this. If they had offered a smaller version of this, I would have bought it. If they had offered a small 1440p or maybe like a ultra-wide 1440p version of this, I would have bought it. But I'm so glad that wasn't available, because surprisingly, one of my favorite things about this is that it's a 48-inch 4K screen. And I wasn't expecting that, but the immersiveness of that, to me, is way above the 34-inch ultra-wide. And I was trying to think about why that is, because I actually sat closer to the ultra-wide. I like most of my field of view to be filled, but then I realized, well, the ultra-wide is actually not filling the top and the bottom of my view when I'm filling the left and right side of the view. The shape of 16:9 does fill my actual view better than ultra-wide does. And guys, I'm an ultra-wide fan, and I've been on an ultra-wide for a couple of years. I actually prefer this. Now, you can actually set custom ultra-wide resolutions on here and game that way. I haven't been doing that, and I haven't wanted to. I've actually really enjoyed having that extra screen real estate on the top and the bottom. I was actually even thinking about how this relates to like VR. Like when I play on my Oculus Quest 2, you get a window into the world like this, and you know, this is kind of like that. I was thinking at the distance that I'm sitting from it, that's like kind of the field of view that I get. It fills my screen right to the point where any bigger would be uncomfortable, but any smaller I think is a downgrade. And that's fantastic. By the way, speaking of how close I sit, I brought my handy dandy little measuring tape here. And the way I actually sit here, I usually kind of, my chair has some like rock back, right? So I'm usually right about here when I'm using it. And let's measure that distance. We're at about 35 inches. So if you can't get, I would say 30 inches might be kind of the limit there. 35 is probably better. If you can't get that far from the screen where this is going to be set up, then I don't think this is going to be a good choice for you. Okay, if you're too close, it's just too much. Now there'll be some people who actually like that. I've seen comments on my channel about that. People saying they sit like 2 feet from like a 65-inch screen. I think they're in the minority here. I think though that if you can get 35 inches back, like I am, it's actually pretty good. And if you're wondering about pixel density, well, that's where the 4K helps out. At that distance, even though the screen's giant, I still can't see individual pixels until I get much closer. I have to get close enough that I wouldn't want to be that close before I can see individual pixels. So I don't think the pixel density is an issue whatsoever. Now, speaking of the size, that's another issue. So the little mount here doesn't come very far out the front, but it does stick a ways out the back. I actually have this, the stand is actually up against the wall here, and yet I still have, let's actually measure it, it's still like 6 or 7 inches out from the wall. So the stand actually sticks out the back 6 or 7 inches. So if you are up against a wall, just keep in mind that that's going to be a bit of an issue when it turns into like how much space you have on your desk and all of that. The screen isn't right at the back. You got to have room for the back of the stand. So you might have heard that LG is coming out with a 42-inch OLED next year, sometime in 2022. I'm actually glad I didn't wait because I was tempted to. But now, if you gave me the chance to trade this in for a 42-inch, I would laugh at you and say, absolutely not. I'm loving the 48-inch. I'm not going to say that that's going to be the same for everybody, but for me, I do not want a smaller screen than this ever again. This is amazing. I love it. One of my favorite things about it. Again, that could be different for different people. I was surprised. I was not expecting that, but I'm loving it. Now, speaking of 4K, this could be another downside for you. In addition to wanting the HDMI 2.1, if you can get it possibly, you also want a 4K capable GPU to fully enjoy the gaming experience on this thing. And that's expensive. Gaming at 4K was expensive. I upgraded my GPU from my 2070, which I would have sat on until the GPU prices got more reasonable again, except I got the 4K screen. So I upgraded to a 4K GPU, 6800 XT if you're curious. I've got a couple of videos about that. And I'm glad I did, but that added a lot more cost to the situation. So keep that in mind. Now, if you're curious like I was when I originally bought this, what's it like if you maybe don't have the most 4K capable GPU? You can definitely play games at lower resolutions on the screen and have it look okay. It's usable. If you were actually using the screen from like your couch or something, it might look fine at that distance. But when you're this close to it, I'm just gonna say, here's something about the size of the 4K screen here. You know when you're watching image comparison videos, if you're the kind of person that does that, with like graphics comparisons and it zooms in like 200%? That's what the experience is like on this thing. It is very revealing because on this size of a screen and with the 4K resolution, you can see everything. So in a game that looks beautiful, that's wonderful. In a game that has any graphical flaws at all, I would say that they're easier to see here because it is such a good and large screen to display it, which also means that if you're playing at a low resolution, you're gonna expand that out and it does become pretty obvious. although I wouldn't say unusable. I would highly recommend actually trying to have a 4K capable GPU if you're going to be doing this thing. Although render scales and resolution scales down with FSR or DLSS or internal render resolution settings in games, you can crank that down quite a bit before it's noticeably impacting your gaming, and then that can bump up your performance to playable levels on maybe non-4K native capable GPUs. I don't want to ramble on about this. So who should buy this thing and who should steer clear? I think that if you're buying this as a second monitor that you primarily use for immersive single-player gaming and or maybe some movie, and especially HDR viewing content, I think absolutely buy it 100%, just do it, okay? If you're somebody who wants to do this primarily for competitive, like really competitive, you're up there at the top couple percent of players gaming, I think the size might actually be a bit of a detractor there. I can perfectly enjoy playing CSGO on here, but I think that if I was extremely competitive at CSGO, having things out toward the edges of my field of view might not be ideal. I might prefer a smaller screen where I can keep more of it in the center of my view at a time. Now, I think you could still compete very competitively and enjoyably on this thing. I just don't think that it's the monitor I would buy if 99.9% of my gaming was extremely competitive esports gaming. Now, if you're somebody who enjoys all sorts of gaming, including competitive gaming like me, I do play a lot of competitive games, just also single-player stuff, I still think it's fine. It's absolutely usable. If you're on that, like, I'm almost a pro at this game or I am a pro at this game tier, and that's just your entire life, this might not be the screen for you. Also, I just don't think 4K makes sense for that. Like, you might want to go down to the 1080p, like 300 and something refresh rate monitors or whatever, you know, that kind of thing. Well, I said it's perfect for somebody who, you know, wants it as a second screen just for immersive single player gaming. It's also very good for somebody like me to use as a main screen. I have the ultra wide over here, but I've honestly been staying away. I don't really want to touch that. I want to do everything here. I've been using this for everything. I've been using it for gaming. I've been using it for just general web browsing. I've been using it to watch YouTube. I've been using it to watch movies. I've been using it to comment on my YouTube channel, look at my channel analytics. I've edited my videos on here using DaVinci Resolve. All of that, every single bit of that, I actually like better than I did on my 34-inch ultra-wide. That gave me a lot of screen real estate. This gives me all of that and more with the addition of the 4K resolution. And it's big. I got lots of room to see everything. I can put multiple windows in different spots. I love it. However, I use it maybe in the 1 to 2, maybe 2 hours a day would probably be pretty typical for my home use, because when I'm at work, I'm not bringing this with me. I teach in a classroom and I'm using a laptop. When I'm at home, again, about 2 hours a day would be pretty typical. Maybe would go up to 4 or 5 hours every couple of days. I might have a day like that, but it's using it for a variety of content. If you're somebody who is just stuck on the same screen, like I'm editing 8 hours of video in the same video editing program, I'm not saying the experience wouldn't be enjoyable, but you might start to worry about the OLED burn-in in that case. So if you're not using it for a variety of content, that could be an issue. But other than that, I think it's really good. So if you're going to be displaying the same images, the same windows, in the same spot for many hours a day, all the time, that's where I'd say maybe use this as a second monitor, not as your only one. Now, if you're somebody who actually wants to just buy this and set it up as a TV that you use for PC gaming from the couch or something like that, or as for console gaming, get this thing. I think it's fantastic for that. So in conclusion, is the best gaming monitor this TV? For me, absolutely yes. I've mentioned a few of the reasons why it might not be for you, but for me, absolutely yes. I highly, highly recommend this thing. And if you're wondering, like, are you not going to get into like measuring the image color accuracy and the input? So there's been so many reviews that have already done that from people who are more experienced and more qualified than me at doing that. I don't think there's any point in me trying to do that. Here's what I can say from the end user experience. Honestly, I was perfectly happy just opening up the menu when I got it, sticking it to game optimized mode so that it decreased the input latency, and calling it a day. I think it looks good, colors are good, all of that from an actual end user, does this look good perspective. If you're trying to get into color accurate work and all of that, you could look into actually calibrating it, and I'm sure you could get it fine. But again, if you're mainly using this as a professional display, I think there's other displays that make more sense for you. I think this thing makes the most sense as something that's primarily used for gaming and or movies, and also could handle a couple hours of productivity, professional use, general web browsing as well. That's, I think, the primary use of this monitor. For me, everything looks good enough pretty much out of the box that I'm not going to obsess over all the calibrations and all of that. Although when you do open up games, make sure that you adjust the brightness settings, and if you're using an HDR game, make sure that you calibrate the HDR settings for that game. Otherwise, you can get bright areas kind of blown out, or if dark areas are too dark. I've seen people complain about black crush on this thing, where you lose some black details. I feel like it's pretty good, but you do want to make sure you set all the brightness stuff correctly. And there's like an subreddit about OLED gaming where they have a whole bunch of recommended settings for this TV. And I've played around with some of that, and I think it can make it look a little bit better. But honestly, I think if your experience wants to be just use this thing out of the box, set it to game mode, and you're happy, I honestly think it's pretty good for the average person. Just like that. All right, everybody, I think I've already rambled on quite a while, but if you have any questions about this stuff, we can talk about it in the comments section. Thank you to subscribers. You guys are beautiful people. Expect future content about this. You know, maybe updates on, am I getting OLED burn-in or anything like that? Did I change my mind after 6 months and get rid of the TV? All of that. Extra special thank you to people who hit the join button. You guys are financially supporting the channel because you're just the best people in the entire world. So, thank you all very much, and I hope all of you have an excellent day.